So we're talking about play and playfulness this morning. And play is both a gift and it's a spiritual way of being. And playfulness and being able to play can become a source of wisdom as well. As I mentioned, I brought a number of playmates into the room with me. So I was, as I was looking at the topic of play, found a story on a site called Earthbeat. It's called Earthbeat, Stories of Climate, Crisis, Faith, and Action. And Richard Heffern is one of the bloggers on that site. And he wrote this. He said, "The holy fool, or the fool as a wise soul, is a figure in many wisdom traditions, including Russian Orthodox spirituality, the Sufis of Islam, Zen Buddhism, Christianity, the inheritors of the Hasidic movement in Judaism. Every tradition has its playful fool, and such fools amuse, they confuse, sometimes they speak in simile or riddles, sometimes they're ridiculed, often they are tricksters and play tricks. They are, after all, intentionally ridiculous, but they succeed by that very character in breaking through a crust of stuckness and ridiculousness and resistance and disbelief. So holy fools have the power to turn our spiritual traditions upside down and inside out so that we can more readily see the truth within them." That's the end of the quote. Now, one of the holy fools that the article referred to was Nasruddin. I don't know, perhaps you've heard of him. He comes out of the Sufi tradition. And Nasruddin was the consummate holy fool. He was mischievous, he was wise, he was a playful storyteller, and his stories are known throughout the Middle East, and actually they show up in cultures around the world. And on the surface, many of his stories might be considered a joke, but they're usually followed by a moral and maybe a little extra something that brings the consciousness a little farther into realization. So here's one short Nasruddin story, and it's called The Sermon. Nasruddin was invited to deliver a sermon. And when he got on the pulpit to speak, he asked the people, "Do you know what I'm going to say?" And the audience replied, "No." So he announced, "I have no desire to speak to people who don't even know what I will be saying." And he left. The people felt embarrassed. They called him back again the next day. And this time, when he asked the same question, "Do you know what I'm going to say?" the people replied, "Yes." So Nasruddin said, "Well, since you already know what I'm going to say, I won't waste any more of your time." And he left. Now the people were really perplexed. They decided to try one more time, and once again, they invited the mullah to speak the following week. Once again, he asked the same question. "Do you know what I'm going to say?" Now the people were prepared. And so half of them answered yes, and half of them answered no. So Nasruddin said, "Well, let the half who know what I'm going to say it, and tell the half who don't know." And he left. End of story. And it's a story that makes us laugh, but it also makes us think. There's a couple, their names are Frederick and Mary Ann Brissett, and they write and teach about the spiritual practice of play. And they know that whether we consider indigenous spirituality or the storytelling traditions of Islam or Zen or the Taoist masters or the great Hasidic storytellers, they all have their traditions around the spiritual gift of play. We encounter Coyote, the trickster, the bumbling adventures of Nasruddin. We hear tongue-in-cheek humor in the Hasidic tradition. Even St. Francis of Assisi had a group of people with him that were called Jesters of the Lord. Zen masters, Taoist sages, Hasidic storytellers, clowns, and performance artists all have spiritual traditions, and they encourage us not to take ourselves too seriously. They say that what we know isn't worth knowing. And what's worth knowing cannot be known through our intellectually disciplined ways. To our sensible selves, their actions seem silly, shameless, and even shocking, but they have an important role in the spiritual life. They carry the banner for the spiritual practice of play. An article at another playmate, theexaminer.com, reminds us that the word spirit comes from the Latin word spiritus, meaning breath. Spirit and spirituality, by their very nature, are animating and alive. The indigenous Hawaiians had a name for the Protestant missionaries who came to save their souls. They called the missionaries haoles, people without breath. And in their serious intent to save the souls of the Pacific Islanders, the missionaries lost their breath. They lost their spirit. They had forgotten how to play. So play and playful thought hold a really powerful way to connect with what our spirits need to survive and to thrive. And play is indeed a spiritual practice. Just think again about the playful child that we connected with. Play becomes the way to connect, to fill that often magical inner space where we find our creativity. So recognizing the deep meaning and healing that can be found as we connect to our playful, creative, and inspirational selves is a spiritual process. Buried deep in the wisdom, in the Jewish tradition, is the idea that play and wisdom are intimately connected. There's a section in the book of Proverbs that tells of wisdom as God's playmate. Wisdom is personified, and she says, I was by God's side, a master crafter, delighting God day by day, ever at play in God's presence, at play everywhere in the world. Matthew Fox is another playmate. And in his 1983 book, Original Blessing, he raises the link between play and compassion. And he writes, compassion requires equality, not subject-object relationships. The key to understanding compassion is to enter into a consciousness of interdependence, which is a consciousness of equality of being. Authentic playfulness nourishes relationships. Think about what happens when we are truly at non-competitive play. If you have grandchildren, recall what it's like to sit down with them to read a story or perhaps play a board game. The rules of any game level the playing field. Old and young alike have to play by the same rules. And remember the three-legged races we used to run? In order for that game to proceed, there had to be a certain kind of trust and interdependence between partners. That would be the key to the enjoyment of the game and the relationships involved. If you didn't cooperate in a three-legged race, you'd both end up on the ground. So a game well played eliminates superior, inferior relationships. And then Ashley Montague entered the room, the playroom. He wrote a work called Growing Young. And he wrote this. He said, of all the animal species that we know, the human is unique in its capacity to continue to play into adulthood and old age. An insect never plays. Think about the ants, they're always working. A chimpanzee plays hard as a youngster, but loses play as an adult. An adult human, however, can play right up until death and can even play with death. But how human are we? How many of our institutions have rendered us insect-like, in our lack of letting go, our lack of celebration as a value, as an authentic source of truth and truthful relating. And this made me think, sadly, that Western religion has been a real culprit in dampening our ability to be playful throughout life. The original intent of a Sabbath was that humans should be able to let go of all the pressures of work and just relax and play and enjoy a day of rest. Jewish tradition teaches that the Sabbath is a gift to humankind. It allows time for play that escapes us during the work week. The Sabbath is intended for enjoyment, for taking walks, for playing with children, for making love, for spending time with friends. It's a day of liberation and joy. So many of you alluded to the freedom that you felt as a child with not having responsibilities. And this is what the Sabbath is about. Now, I have to tell you, the Sabbath notions that I grew up with were so restrictive. So many times as a child heard, no, you can't do that. It's Sunday. And historically, in the early colonies, people were punished if they failed to keep the stringent rules that regarded the Sabbath. Breaking the Sabbath became a fearful thing. The joyful playfulness of the gift got subsumed in rules and regulations. The rigid restrictions even dampened our ability to conceive of and enjoy a divine playmate. Hildegard of Bingen, a medieval poet, joins the playroom. In a much more playful mind, she compared the relationship between the creator and creation to that of a lover with his beloved, to that of a husband and wife. Hildegard wrote, "The entire world has been embraced by the Creator's kiss." John Wesley, a much later person, the founder of religion, he was heard saying that sour godliness is the devil's religion. With a very light touch, Matthew Fox once again suggests that perhaps the time has come to play with God more than to pray to God. In our play, true prayer will emerge, and we will emerge as younger, fresher, and greener. I am so impressed always that the more creation-centered theology that arises from the mystics of the Middle Ages is so much closer to the biblical intent for humanity than what has evolved over the centuries. In the mid-1200s, Meister Eckhart had a mystical term for play, and it was to live without a why, to work without a why, to love without a why. He saw that as essentially seeing life as a grand playground. Playfulness is itself a way of resolving deep pain and division. I read that there are Eskimo tribes, for example, who, when a war with another tribe is beginning to percolate and brew, they would call forth the two best poets of each tribe for a contest. The jury was made up of an equal number of members of each tribe. The winning poet would win the war for both sides. Imagine such a solution for breaking the gridlock in the US Senate. And the more I think about it, the clearer it is to me that our esteemed houses of Congress have lost the spirituality of play. And when we lose that, we lose our resilience and our capacity for compassion and cooperation. Once again, Matthew Fox points to our so-called defense departments, so creative at building sadistic weaponry, but lacking the imagination, such a critical part of play when it comes to the moral equivalence for war. Play is meant to be a way out of aggression, but our culture has forgotten the value of play on so many levels. And so we lock ourselves into trillion-dollar military budgets and imagine that we can buy security. Play It's the exuberant expression of our being, no matter how young or how old we are. It's at the heart of our creativity, our sexuality, our most carefree moments of devotion. Play helps us live with absurdity, like the year that we have just come through. Play helps us live with paradox and with mystery. It feeds our joy and our sense of wonder, and it keeps our search for meaning down to earth. Another playmate, her name is Nika Quirk. Now that's a playful name if I ever heard one, but she's an improvisational leader, and she believes that play is indeed a spiritual practice. She describes play as a profound act. Play becomes the way to connect to and to fill that magical space inside us from which we create. Recognizing the deep meaning and healing that can be found as we connect to our playful, creative, and inspirational selves is a spiritual process. But how do we play when our bodies no longer want to move on the tennis court, or take to hiking a trail in the woods and perhaps resulting in a broken shoulder, tripping over a root? How do we play when the print on the familiar board games is too small to read easily? Frederick and Marianne Brissett, more playmakers, are practitioners about the spirituality of play, and they offer these words of basic practice. Play is an exuberant expression of our being. In somewhat paradoxical sense, play is the work of the soul. It's at the heart of our creativity and our most carefree moments of devotion. It feeds our joy and our wonder. We can practice play by doing things on the spur of the moment. A friend calls to say, hey, you got a minute for a cup of tea? And we drop everything and go. We can learn to laugh heartily at jokes instead of just going, We can learn heartily to laugh at situations that trouble us, and we can learn to laugh heartily at ourselves. We can practice play by not taking ourselves so seriously that all the fun is stripped out of life and from our activities. And we can remember that laughter heals the body, the mind, and the soul. And by extension, our laughter heals our communities. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my very favorite playmates, is a modern Jewish theologian and mystic, and he wrote, "The holy is hiding in the world, and our task is to let the divine emerge from our deeds." What better way to think about play as a spiritual practice than to understand that when we find ways to play, we co-conspire to let the holy emerge and permeate the world. Simply put, our willingness to play becomes a holy act that makes the world a better place. We began our service by dedicating our thoughts and reflections on play to our dear friend Ken Beebe. So we might end by acknowledging that along with Coyote the Trickster, with the comic storytelling of Nasruddin, with St. Francis' gestures for the Lord, Ken was a fount of wisdom for our time. Ken challenged us to learn how to play, and we honor his memory when we are just plain having fun. Amen.